The Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, September 17, 1862, a forensic narrative of blood, blunders, and bravery. The summer of 1862 was a fever pitch in the American Civil War. Both North and South had been bloodied, bruised, and unrelenting. But no one had quite shaken things up like General Robert E. Lee. Tall, gray-bearded, with a posture straight enough to snap a spine, Lee was riding high on a string of victories that left Union forces flustered and demoralized. The summer's heat had scorched the Union's pride, and now Lee, daring as ever, decided it was time to bring the war to the Union's front door. Before we dive into the explosive events at Sharpsburg, or Antietam, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you're standing, let's rewind a bit and understand how we got here. The Confederacy, which had been on the defensive for much of the war's early days, was now fighting with the swagger of a boxer on a winning streak. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had won a series of battles that could only be described as bold, audacious, and reckless, in other words, vintage Robert E. Lee. The 7 Days Battles, June 25 to July 1, 1862, the Union had been knocking on the door of Richmond, the Confederate capital, with General George B. McClellan, our main character in this drama, leading the charge. His Union Army of the Potomac was poised for what should have been a victory. But Lee, in his first major offensive campaign, danced around McClellan's forces, outwitting, outmaneuvering, and launching relentless attacks that forced McClellan to retreat from the outskirts of Richmond. In just 7 days, McClellan's grand plans unraveled. Second Battle of Bull Run, August 28 to 30, 1862, riding high from the 7 days, Lee partnered with his ever-reliable right arm, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, to deliver another humiliation to the Union. At Bull Run, Lee's smaller Confederate force clobbered Major General John Pope's Army of Virginia, setting the stage for his invasion of the North. Lee was, quite frankly, unstoppable, or so it seemed. Now, if Robert E. Lee was the bold tactician, George B. McClellan was his polar opposite, a man of profound caution, meticulous organization, and a baffling inability to act when it mattered most. McClellan, affectionately known as Little Mac, though his ego was anything but little, was loved by his soldiers but loathed by Lincoln. He had the face of a dashing officer, but beneath that polished surface lay a general who was more inclined to throw grand parades than decisive punches. Born in Philadelphia to an affluent family, McClellan was a West Point graduate, second in his class of 1846. His military career seemed destined for greatness from the start. He fought in the Mexican-American War and later spent time in Europe, studying military tactics and honing his craft. Politically, McClellan leaned Democrat, and he was a staunch believer in preserving the Union as it was, slavery intact. His conservatism put him at odds with Abraham Lincoln, the Republican president who saw McClellan as more of an obstacle than a solution. Their relationship was rocky, to say the least. McClellan once referred to Lincoln as a well-meaning baboon, hardly the kind of language you'd expect between a general and his commander-in-chief. But McClellan had powerful friends in Washington, including the Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. Still, his greatest enemy wasn't Lee, it was his own hesitancy. As the war dragged on, McClellan's reputation for missed opportunities became legendary. After the 7 Days battles, instead of pressing on and using his numerical superiority to crush Lee, McClellan retreated. "I could have whipped them," McClellan famously declared to his superiors, but, of course, he hadn't. President Lincoln, already frustrated, famously quipped, "If General McClellan isn't going to use his army, I'd like to borrow it for a while." Ouch. McClellan's conservatism and his reluctance to risk casualties kept him from launching decisive strikes, which allowed Lee to stay one step ahead. And now, we come to one of the most bizarre moments in Civil War history. On September 13, 1862, just 4 days before the Battle of Antietam, fate intervened in a way no one could have predicted. 2 Union soldiers, likely privates on a routine march, stumbled upon an envelope wrapped around 3 cigars. Now, these were no ordinary cigars. Inside that envelope was Special Order 191, Robert E. Lee's detailed battle plan for the Maryland campaign. The order explained how Lee had divided his army, scattering his forces across Maryland. So, how did this priceless document end up in Union hands? The mystery lingers, but the most accepted theory is that the order had been carelessly lost by a Confederate courier under General D.H. Hill. One would imagine the poor courier lit a cigar in frustration when he realized what he'd lost, assuming he ever figured it out. The 2 Union soldiers, excited and perhaps a little confused, took the order to their commanding officers, and eventually, it landed on McClellan's desk. McClellan couldn't believe his luck. "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home," McClellan allegedly said. And yet, true to form, McClellan waited. For 18 hours, he deliberated, second-guessed, and hesitated. McClellan's army outnumbered Lee's nearly 2-1. This was the golden opportunity he'd been waiting for, the moment to end the war in a single, decisive blow. But McClellan, ever cautious, moved slowly. Instead of launching an immediate assault, he took 2 more days to mobilize his forces. His slowness allowed Lee to regroup and concentrate his army around the town of Sharpsburg, along the banks of Antietam Creek. Lee knew the odds were against him. He had fewer than 40,000 soldiers, while McClellan was advancing with a force of nearly 90,000. But Lee, ever the gambler, positioned his men defensively and prepared for the worst. The dawn of September 17, 1862, brought with it the bloodiest single day in American history. For 12 brutal hours, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a series of deadly engagements along Antietam Creek. As the golden evening sun dipped below the horizon on September 16, 1862, a strange sense of serenity blanketed the rolling fields of Sharpsburg, Maryland. On any other day, this would have been the kind of picturesque scene you'd see in a painting, except for the fact that 2 massive armies were facing off across the narrow Antietam Creek, bracing for a battle that would forever mark this peaceful place with blood and tragedy. It was the proverbial calm before the storm. On one side of the creek stood General Robert E. Lee, commanding his battle-hardened army of Northern Virginia, numbering around 38,000 men. Across the water, a much larger Union force, the Army of the Potomac, led by the cautious Major General George B. McClellan, boasted over 87,000 soldiers. Both sides knew that when the sun rose the next morning, it would bring with it one of the bloodiest confrontations in American history. For General Robert E. Lee, this was the ultimate gamble. He had divided his army to capture Harper's Ferry, which had left his forces at Sharpsburg thin and exposed. But Lee was no stranger to high-stakes risks, and despite being outnumbered more than 2-1, he believed in the fighting spirit of his men. Of course, part of Lee's strategy hinged on the hope that his opponent, McClellan, would remain true to form, hesitant, overly cautious, and reluctant to attack until everything was just right. Lee sat with his officers under a tree that evening, calmly reviewing his plans. His piercing eyes studied the map, but there was no panic in his voice. "We may be outnumbered, gentlemen, but I expect General McClellan to grant us more time than we deserve," Lee said, with a faint, almost sardonic smile. He understood McClellan's style better than anyone, perhaps even better than McClellan himself. Meanwhile, over on the Confederate left flank near the Dunker Church, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was busy doing what he did best, preparing for battle with an unflinching calm that both inspired and unnerved his men. Jackson, ever the stoic, had earned his nickname by standing like a stone wall at the first battle of Bull Run, and now his legendary poise would once again be put to the test. As the sun set, Jackson spoke to his officers in his typical terse manner. "Tomorrow, we shall give them the bayonet," he said, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. His men were exhausted from weeks of hard fighting, but Jackson's steely confidence was contagious. They knew that no matter how fierce the battle, their general would be the last to flinch. On the Confederate right flank, General James Longstreet was overseeing the placement of his artillery and infantry. Longstreet, known for his defensive acumen, was Lee's most trusted corps commander when it came to holding the line. His gruff demeanor and imposing stature made him the ideal leader for what was sure to be a desperate stand. Longstreet walked the lines as his men dug in, setting up fortifications and positioning their cannons. He gave simple, straightforward orders, and there was no need for grand speeches. His men knew what was coming. "Dig deep, boys," Longstreet said, his voice a low growl. "Tomorrow, we'll be making our stand in the dirt." General A.P. Hill, meanwhile, wasn't even on the battlefield yet. He and his division were still at Harper's Ferry, wrapping up the capture of a key Union garrison. Lee had sent an urgent message for Hill to bring his men to Sharpsburg as quickly as possible. Hill, always one to push his men hard, would march them relentlessly through the night to reach the battlefield just in time to play a critical role the next day, but more on that later. On the other side of Antietam Creek, the Union forces were in a very different frame of mind. Major General George B. McClellan stood at the helm of an army twice the size of Lee's, but as usual, his monumental caution was already getting in the way. Despite having every advantage, superior numbers, superior artillery, and intelligence that gave him a clear view of Lee's position, McClellan hesitated. McClellan was a man of great ambition but also crippling doubt. His reluctance to act was legendary, and his officers knew it all too well. "Tomorrow, we shall whip Bobby Lee," McClellan declared to his staff with grand confidence. But deep down, he was already second-guessing himself. "I just need a little more time," he muttered to himself, poring over maps late into the night. While McClellan hesitated, General Joseph "Fighting Joe" Hooker was anything but shy. Hooker, commanding the Union right, was itching for a fight and would lead the first assault the following morning. He was known for his aggressive, no-nonsense style, and if McClellan wasn't going to act decisively, Hooker sure would. Hooker rode out to survey the Confederate positions as dusk fell. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the terrain. "Well," Hooker muttered, "if there's one thing I love, it's an outnumbered opponent." He grinned, knowing that the next day's battle would give him the chance to live up to his nickname. Hooker didn't do anything halfway, he was going all in. In the Union Center, General Edwin Sumner was preparing his men for battle. Sumner was a bold leader, but sometimes boldness and recklessness looked a little too similar. The next day, his orders would lead to one of the most devastating charges of the entire battle, with massive Union casualties. But on the evening of September 16th, Sumner was full of optimism. As he sat with his officers that night, Sumner raised a glass of whiskey. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we'll dine in Sharpsburg," he proclaimed with a confident smile. Little did he know that the cost of reaching Sharpsburg would be paid in blood. Finally, on the Union left, General Ambrose Burnside was preparing for what would become one of the most infamous moments of the battle, Burnside's Bridge. The narrow stone bridge across Antietam Creek was perfectly positioned for a Confederate defense, and Burnside's job was to get his men across it. Unfortunately for Burnside, his task would prove to be an almost impossible nightmare. As Burnside examined the bridge and the high bluffs that overlooked it, he frowned. "That bridge is going to be the death of us," he muttered under his breath. His words would prove to be uncomfortably accurate the next day when his men were cut down by Confederate sharpshooters in what would become a desperate, bloody struggle to cross the creek. As night fell on September 16, 1862, the quiet calm before the storm settled over the landscape. The crackling of campfires and the low murmur of soldiers' conversations were the only sounds that broke the silence. Both armies knew that when the sun rose the next day, they would be facing one of the deadliest days in American history. On the Confederate side, Lee sat quietly, his calm exterior masking the weight of the gamble he had placed. He trusted his generals, Jackson, Longstreet, and Hill, to hold the line against overwhelming odds. "We are in God's hands now," he whispered to an aide before turning in for the night. Across the creek, McClellan continued to deliberate, poring over his maps and second-guessing his decisions. Despite all the advantages in his favor, McClellan couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. "Tomorrow," he told his officers, "we will attack. But we must be cautious." His men, eager for action, could only hope that their general wouldn't wait too long. And so, as the stars twinkled in the night sky, both armies prepared for the dawn. The Confederate forces, outnumbered and outgunned, could only hope that Lee's bold gamble would pay off. The Union forces, with every advantage in their favor, waited for their hesitant commander to make his move. Tomorrow, the Battle of Antietam would begin, and by the end of the day, over 22,000 men would be dead, wounded, or missing, the bloodiest single day in American history. But for now, both armies waited in the eerie quiet of the night, knowing full well that the storm was. Dawn on September 17, 1862, was the kind that poets write about, a soft, peaceful light creeping over the fields. But this was no ordinary dawn. This was the dawn that would mark the bloodiest single day in American history. At 5:30 a.m., Union artillery shattered the tranquility as General Joseph Hooker's forces opened fire on the Confederate left flank, commanded by none other than the ever-stoic General Stonewall Jackson. The battlefield? A humble farmer's cornfield that would soon gain eternal infamy as the Cornfield. You see, this wasn't just any cornfield, it became a meat grinder. Wave after wave of Union soldiers charged through the stalks, which seemed to mock them by standing tall even as men fell around them. The Confederate artillery and musket fire were relentless. By the time the guns had their say, the corn was as flattened as if God himself had swung a scythe through it. Brigadier General John Gibbon, commanding the Union's Iron Brigade, later remarked, "The dead lay in rows like soldiers in their graves." And he wasn't exaggerating. The morning air was thick with smoke, the sound of muskets cracking like a relentless drumbeat. The Union troops, despite their bravery, were being decimated. But where was the backup? McClellan, our ever-cautious Union commander, held back reserves like a poker player afraid to go all in. He had the chance to overwhelm Jackson's exhausted forces, but he hesitated, again. Meanwhile, Stonewall Jackson, always as cool as a cucumber under fire, was making every bullet count. His soldiers, ragged and outnumbered, fought with the kind of desperation that only comes when you know there's no retreat. Jackson's men were stretched thin, but they were determined to hold their ground. After all, who wants to explain to General Lee why they let the Union Army walk all over them? By mid-morning, the battle had shifted to another grisly stage, the sunken road, which history would rename Bloody Lane. It was a sunken country road, perfect for a defensive line, and Confederate forces had dug themselves in like ticks on a dog. For hours, Union troops charged, and for hours, they were repelled. The Confederate line was holding, using the road's natural cover to their advantage. But, as fate would have it, the Union forces managed to outflank the Confederate line. It was a turning point, and the sunken road became a death trap. Bodies began piling up until, as one horrified witness described, it looked like a ghastly river of blood. The road that had once provided perfect cover now served as a mass grave, and General Lee, watching from a distance, saw his men being slaughtered with little he could do. His forces were stretched thinner than an overcooked pancake, and the battle teetered on the edge of disaster. And then there was General Ambrose Burnside, the man tasked with attacking the Confederate right flank by crossing a small stone bridge over Antietam Creek. This bridge, which should have been an afterthought in military terms, would go down in history as Burnside's Bridge, and not for good reasons. Burnside, bless his heart, took his time preparing for the assault, so much time that Confederate sharpshooters from Georgia had ample opportunity to dig in on the ridge overlooking the bridge. Perched high above, they picked off Burnside's men like ducks in a shooting gallery. For hours, the Union soldiers were slaughtered as they attempted to cross the narrow bridge, one by one. Burnside, growing increasingly frustrated, as one does when their army is being systematically obliterated, is rumored to have shouted at his men to get across that bridge. His soldiers, of course, were doing their best not to get shot, but Burnside's impatience didn't help. Eventually, they succeeded, but not before Confederate General A.P. Hill and his men arrived on the scene like the cavalry in an old western, having marched a grueling 17 miles from Harper's Ferry. Hill's timely arrival saved the Confederate army from complete destruction, and Burnside's success was too little, too late. As the sun set on September 17, 1862, the battlefield was a nightmarish scene. Nearly 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The Cornfield, Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge were all etched into history, along with the blood and tears of those who fought there. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but the real tragedy lay in the missed opportunities. General Lee, ever the gambler, withdrew his battered army across the Potomac and back into Virginia. He had fought bravely, but his army was hanging by a thread. McClellan, meanwhile, had Lee right where he wanted him, on the ropes, outnumbered, and vulnerable. But once again, McClellan hesitated. He didn't pursue Lee's retreating forces, allowing the Confederates to escape. It was the military equivalent of missing an open goal in soccer. President Lincoln was furious. McClellan had been given every advantage and yet had let Lee slip through his fingers. Lincoln, in typical dry fashion, reportedly said that McClellan had a case of the slows. Shortly after, McClellan was dismissed. His caution had cost the Union a chance to end the war sooner, and he would never again command the Army of the Potomac. General Lee, for his part, learned a painful lesson: even brilliant tactics couldn't always overcome superior numbers and resources. His army was resilient, but the war was far from over. As for Burnside, well, the less said, the better. His bridge-crossing debacle earned him scorn and ridicule from both sides, and it would haunt him for the rest of his military career. Amidst all the carnage, there were countless personal stories of heroism, loss, and tragedy. Many soldiers faced former friends and even family members across the battlefield. One Union soldier later recalled seeing his own cousin, fighting for the Confederacy, fall during the battle. "We were boys together," he said, "and now we lay separated by politics and war." McClellan, the man born into wealth and privilege, would always be remembered for his indecision, a brilliant organizer but a hesitant warrior. In contrast, Lee, who hailed from one of Virginia's most prestigious families, staked everything on the belief that Southern independence was worth any price, including bloodshed on an unimaginable scale. Though the battle itself was a tactical draw, it gave President Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which forever changed the course of the war. Antietam was a turning point in the Civil War, a day of blood and fire that neither side would ever forget. And so, September 17, 1862, passed into history, leaving behind a legacy of missed opportunities, heroism, and unimaginable sacrifice, a day when ordinary men, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, fought and died for causes larger than themselves. Don't miss your chance to experience history like never before. Follow us, subscribe, and click the notification button. Together, let's uncover the stories that deserve to be told, and let's ensure they're never forgotten. Join us on this journey through time, and be part of something truly extraordinary.